Close your eyes now and take a deep breath. Tonight we travel far away to a time long gone, to a land blanketed in snow and a world without warmth unless it was earned. The wind howls beyond the trees, but within the thick silence of a medieval village there is stillness. A stillness so complete it feels as if the world itself is holding its breath. Morning has not yet broken. The stars still linger in the sky, dim behind frost-covered clouds. And in a small timber-framed home, a man opens his eyes. His name is Oswin, a peasant farmer, a father, a man of quiet strength. He does not wake to an alarm. He wakes because the cold demands it. His first thought is not of chores or prayer, but fire. The hearth has faded overnight, down to orange coals hiding beneath ash. With practiced hands he breathes life into it. Twigs, then a branch. The flames begin to rise, licking the air with quiet gratitude. The fire is not just warmth, it is survival. Behind him his wife stirs, Agnes. Her eyes meet his, they do not speak. They've done this too many winters to need words. The children are still bundled together beneath the thickest wool they own, their breath forming small clouds in the air. The youngest, barely 5, clutches a stuffed linen doll. Audio, knife, scraping, wooden bowl placed softly on table. Agnes unwraps their breakfast. A round of rye bread, dry and cracking. A wedge of cheese nearly as hard as stone. They'll warm it by the fire. If there is meat left, they may shave off a sliver to share. Outside, the snow waits. The day has begun. Not with sunlight, but with ritual. Oswin steps out, boots sinking into fresh snow. His breath curls before him, vanishing into the pale light of dawn. He carries a pail toward the well. The village is just waking. From a nearby cottage, a goat bleats. A woman coughs. Smoke rises from rooftops in sleepy spirals. He lowers the bucket into the well. The rope groans under the weight. His hands, already numb, ache against the freezing wood. But this is normal. Back home, the children awaken. Their cheeks flushed with cold, eyes sleepy. They stretch, and Agnes greets them with a quiet smile. Beside the fire, she lights a small candle in front of St. Bridget, protector of the hearth. The flame flickers, reflecting in her tired eyes. She whispers a prayer, not for miracles, just for warmth. Their eldest, Edwin, is already dressing. He will follow Oswin into the frost-covered fields. There is no farming today, but fences must be mended, tools cleaned, snow cleared, each task small, but essential. By the time the sun crests the horizon, the village is alive again, quietly, modestly, not with grandeur, but with movement, a sip of warm broth, a crust of bread, a laugh shared between mother and daughter, the routines of survival, the soft resilience of ordinary people. And as another day unfolds beneath layers of snow, we remember survival was not won in battles or with kings. It was earned each morning, in silence, in snow, and in the warmth of a small, glowing fire. A medieval winter did not forgive the unprepared. And yet, every peasant home had its own quiet strategies, simple, time-worn traditions, passed down like heirlooms, not for beauty, but for survival. Tonight, we step further into that cold world and see how peasants kept their homes warm against the long, merciless nights. Most cottages in the Middle Ages had just one room, one fireplace, one family, doing all they could to preserve heat every hour of the day. The walls, often made of wattle and daub, woven wooden strips packed with clay and straw, insulating not much, but better than nothing. The roof, thatched, thick and steep, designed to shed snow but not trap warmth. So they adapted. Oswin lines the drafty corners with sheep's wool. Agnes hangs thick tapestries and old furs over the door and shutter cracks, not for decoration, but to keep the night out, sometimes even straw was packed between wall gaps, an ancient insulation, crude but clever. In the heart of the home, the hearth, life flickered and breathed. It was never allowed to die completely. Someone always woke early to stoke it. At night, ashes were packed over the embers to smother flames but keep the heat alive till morning. They didn't waste firewood. Each log was earned, split by hand, and stored carefully beneath roof eaves, away from snow. Firewood was a daily necessity, and a precious one. Oak and ash burned hot and slow. Pine sparked too much. Birch was a blessing, even the act of gathering it, walking through snow, breaking frozen limbs, dragging heavy bundles, was part of staying warm, because movement was heat. They found warmth in clever ways. Hot stones wrapped in cloth, placed near sleeping feet. Clay jars filled with boiled water, warmed the bed just enough for sleep. Blankets weren't always enough, so people used their minds just as much as their hands. And yet... Wool was everything. Wool from their own sheep became tunics, stockings, cloaks, and bedding. Not soft, not luxurious, but thick, durable. Wool held heat even when damp. It was scratchy, heavy, but life-saving. Every family had their pile of winter clothes, layer upon layer. Even sleeping was done fully dressed. There were no pajamas, only layers of the same clothes worn during the day. Undergarments, linen, outer garments, wool, blankets, as many as they owned. And still, cold crept in. So they adapted not just the home, but themselves. Warmth came from within, too. Hot meals, thick stews, a sip of warmed ale or cider, pottage, a bubbling mix of root vegetables, grains, herbs, and anything left over, was a staple. It was cheap, simple, and hot, and that heat spread through the body like a second fire. They maintained their homes constantly. Leaks in the roof meant damp. Damp meant death. So even in snow, repairs were made, roofs patched, walls sealed. No luxury, only necessity. By nightfall, the fire was banked, blankets gathered. The family curled into sleep like wolves in a den. Not alone, but together. Even the animals, dogs, chickens, goats, slept nearby, offering their own warmth. Every living body was a source of heat. They didn't need central heating. They had fire, wool, and each other. And in a world frozen solid beyond the shutters, that was enough. As the day gives way to dusk, the chill deepens. The fire grows more important now. But it isn't the only thing that keeps a family alive. Tonight, we step further into the daily rhythm of survival. How medieval peasants made it through the darkest seasons, not just with fire and wool, but with food and faith. Firewood was everything. Oswin and his son haul the last bundle of the day, carefully stacked, slowly gathered, each log a promise of warmth for the night ahead. No task was too small to matter in winter. Fire meant more than comfort. It meant cooking, drying clothes, heating water, and even light. Dinner is simple, but nourishing. Pottage again, today made with cabbage, barley, a hint of onion, and a pinch of sage. No meat tonight. It must last. The family eats slowly, quietly, savoring each warm bite. A single pot feeds them all. Food in winter was always a matter of balance. What to save, what to eat, what to hope would last. Preservation was an art. Root vegetables were buried in straw. Cheese was hung near the rafters. Apples, if stored properly, might last until spring. Dried herbs hung in bunches, their smells faint but comforting. There were no pantries full of abundance. Only what had been grown, gathered, and guarded. A family that planned well might make it to spring with food still left. A family that didn't might not make it at all. And so they shared, traded, scraped together what they could. Neighbor helped neighbor. Because everyone knew hunger didn't care about pride. Even in the coldest months, moments of joy still lived in the kitchen. Bread baking in the coals, honey saved for special days, warm broth in a wooden cup. These things weren't luxuries, they were little acts of hope, proof that life, even in hardship, could still hold sweetness. But warmth and food were not enough to keep spirits whole. Faith was the thread that wove their lives together. The local chapel, though cold and small, was a beacon they prayed for warmth, for health, for mercy in the frost, and for spring to come soon. Religion wasn't just ceremony, it was comfort, a belief that beyond the suffering there was purpose, that hardship had meaning, that even the poorest soul was seen by heaven. Each night, Agnes offered thanks, not for abundance, but for enough. A roof overhead, a fire that still burned, children who still breathed. Faith wasn't loud, it was quiet, like the snow. The fire is fed, the doors are barred. Outside the wind carries stories through the trees, but inside it is still, a silence heavy with gratitude, a warmth held together by ritual and rhythm, by the care of hands and the power of belief. And as the night deepens beyond the shutters, the family drifts into sleep once more, fed, warm, and held by faith. Warmth wasn't just made of wool and wood, it was made of people. Tonight, we move closer to the glow, not of fire alone, but of shared lives, shared breath, shared burdens. We gather around the hearth, where community became survival. Most peasant families didn't live alone. A home was rarely just a nuclear unit. It was parents, children, grandparents, cousins, even a neighbor fallen on hard times. The more bodies in a room, the more warmth in the air. This was not mere convenience. It was necessity. Old bones needed fire. Young hearts needed stories. The hearth, stone-built, blackened by years, was the sun of the home. Everything orbited around it. Tasks were done by firelight, wool spun, tools repaired, bread kneaded and placed into the coals. No idle hands, but no rush either. Time moved slowly in winter. The hours were long and filled with simple presence. Food was shared, always, a single pot stretched across many bowls. No one ate alone. They knew, if one starved, all would feel it. So meals were made to be shared. And warmth, like food, was passed from hand to hand. And in these long nights, stories came alive. Tales of saints and spirits, of old kings in green forests, of wolves in winter and miracles in the frost. Children sat wide-eyed, faces lit not just by fire, but by imagination. They sang, too, simple hymns, old pagan melodies turned Christian over generations. Music softened the silence. It warmed the mind as the fire warmed the skin. These were not performances, but rituals, reminders that together they were more than individuals. They were one body. When someone fell ill, they were never alone. Hands were laid in prayer, herbs were brought, stories told more gently, the fire made stronger. To survive the coldest nights, no one could be forgotten. At night, they slept together, tightly packed, shoulder to shoulder, sharing not only space, but life. In summer, they may have spread apart, but in winter, togetherness was warmth. Even in silence, they breathed as one. Communal living wasn't a choice. It was the oldest technology of survival. Older than fire, older than walls. It was love, and it was life, and it kept the cold outside, and the last ember hissed beneath the hearth. A new challenge began, sleeping through the cold. Tonight, we pull back the woolen curtain and step into the shared slumber of a medieval peasant's world, not in feather beds or private chambers, but in bundled straw and in the precious heat of human closeness. There were no mattresses in most homes, at least none as we know them. Instead, piles of straw stuffed into linen or sackcloth, sometimes with old wool or feathers mixed in. If you were lucky, they were laid directly on wooden slats or the cold stone floor. No springs, just the scent of dried grass and the creak of timber. Blankets were precious, homespun, hand-dyed, and often passed down through generations, rough to the touch, but thick. Sometimes families would stitch together old cloaks, animal hides, and scraps of felt to create makeshift bedding. A luxury? Not quite. But for those sleeping beneath snow-covered rooftops, it was treasure. Nightwear was not separate. There were no pajamas. Most slept in their linen tunics, sometimes naked beneath thick wool. Others layered everything they owned, shirts over shirts, cloaks over shoulders. The warmth of clothing was protection against the silence of frost. Sleeping was not a solitary act. Children nestled between adults. Siblings curled close. Sometimes even animals were brought indoors, goats, dogs, or chickens, their body heat a vital contribution. No one questioned the closeness. It was a quiet contract of survival, and this, too, had rhythm. The eldest often slept closest to the fire, the youngest bundled in the center, and the others surrounding like petals on a flower. The warmth traveled body to body, a silent, invisible thread holding them all through the night. It was not always enough. There were nights when cold still crept in, when fingers turned numb, when dreams froze mid-flight. But even then, no one was ever cold alone. There were tricks, of course, stone bricks heated by fire and wrapped in cloth, placed beneath the bedding, boiled water sealed in old skins tucked near the legs. And the old ones, they remembered to tell the young, keep your boots near the fire, sleep with your arms tucked in, and don't sleep too far from someone you love. The sleeping arrangement was not elegant, it was not spacious, but it was human. It whispered the oldest truth. Warmth is a shared thing, not owned, but offered in the cold dark. When stars blinked above frozen fields, sleep came not in silence, but in breath and warmth and the peace of being together. Even when the cold crept in like a silent thief, it was kindness that stood guard at the door. Beyond the modest homes and thatched roofs, beyond the frost-covered wells and frozen pastures, there pulsed a heartbeat, the heartbeat of the village itself. It wasn't just warmth that kept people alive through winter, it was people. In times when snow buried crops and rivers froze to silence, the people of the village became each other's fire. If one family lacked firewood, another would share a bundle. If someone had extra turnips, they'd trade it for a bit of cheese or dried herbs. This wasn't charity, it was survival through unity. They watched for each other, the old, the widowed, the sick. These were never truly alone. Neighbors would bring a bowl of broth, a warm stone from their own hearth, or simply their presence, for in the coldest season, a single visit could mean the difference between fading into the frost and making it to the thaw. Winter, despite its bite, also brought gathering. Nights were long, so families lit tallow candles and opened their doors to others. Stories were shared of saints and sinners, of wolves and wandering spirits, of ancient winters much colder than this. And for a while, the world outside melted away. There were moments of celebration, too. Midwinter festivals, simple, joyous affairs, were held to remind everyone that light still lived within the dark. Even if all they had was a single goose or one cask of ale, it was shared. The cold was still there, but so were the songs. Children learned kindness early. They were taught to give, not because they had abundance, but because they understood scarcity. No child slept warm while another shivered. That was the unspoken rule etched in every generation. In times of true peril, entire villages would move into barns, chapels, or even large homes. They would sleep side by side, dozens of souls bundled in cloaks and hay, surrounded by the steady breath of cows and sheep. It was crowded, yes, but it was safe and strangely warm. Kindness came in many forms: a shared recipe, a pair of mittens knit from leftover yarn, an old man teaching a young girl how to repair her shoes. These acts didn't make the nights less cold, but they made them worth surviving. The village didn't just endure winter, it endured it together, and that was its greatest strength. Not its walls, not its hearths, but the silent understanding that no one would be left behind. So when night fell, and shadows lengthened, and snow blanketed the rooftops once more, people slept not just in straw and wool, but wrapped in the invisible warmth of a village that cared. The world outside seemed still, frozen in time, silent in suffering, but inside small cottages, beyond the eyes of kings and lords, another kind of wisdom stirred, not in books but in bundles of herbs, jars of honey, and hands made strong by necessity. This was the season of the peasant healer. She may have been a grandmother, or a middle-aged widow, sometimes even a quiet young man, marked as odd by the rest of the village, but to those in need, they were the lifeline through the winter. Without physicians, without apothecaries, these humble herbalists became the keepers of life. Even as the earth slumbered, nature offered help in unexpected places. Roots buried beneath the soil, tree bark soaked in snow, and herbs dried during summer now came into use. Thyme to soothe coughs, elderberry to ward off fevers, and a bit of garlic to keep the rot away. These weren't magic potions. They were practical, passed down like sacred songs. Their hands worked with care, a poultice for frostbite, a tea for aching joints, a salve for cracked skin. Everything had a purpose, and everything took time. This work, quiet and slow, was never glamorous, but it saved lives in the coldest months. The peasant healer's greatest tool was warmth. Not just warmth from fire, but warmth from presence. To sit by the ill, to whisper soft prayers, to bring calm to a frightened heart. This, too, was medicine, and often it worked. Many nights were spent not in sleep, but in motion. If a fever struck or a baby came early, she would be called, sometimes in the dead of night. And she would go. She didn't charge gold. She didn't seek reward. She did it because no one else would. The healer knew the land as well as she knew the people. She knew where to find burdock root in the cold shadow of the well, and which part of a nettle plant to boil to ease stomach pains. Knowledge was power, but not the kind used for control. It was power used for comfort, and this wisdom was never hoarded. When the snow melted and the first green shoots appeared, she would teach because survival meant passing it on, and so her secrets became the village's strength. Today we might call it folklore, but to the medieval peasant it was as real as rain or fire. A world where thyme and tallow, vinegar and vervain were part of a sacred rhythm that sang through the winter nights. So when winter howled at the door, the peasant healer answered not with fear, but with warmth, wisdom, and a cup of something gently steaming, and death felt near. There was something else the peasants turned to, belief. Not belief in science, not quite religion alone, but in the old ways, in charms, tokens, and whispered words carried by memory and fear. The cold brought more than frostbite. It brought things unseen, illness, spirits, curses, and so the people lit more than fires. They lit protections. To the medieval mind, sickness wasn't just something in the body. It might be something that entered the home, through a window left open, a grudge left unresolved, a spirit not properly appeased, so they warded off the unknown. With colours, with shapes, with meaning layered in generations of fear and hope. Red thread to protect newborns, garlic braided and hung to guard the hearth, iron horseshoes above the door to confuse wandering spirits. Even children knew some of these signs. They might carve a protective mark in the beams, or whisper a rhyme before drinking cold water. Much of it seemed silly. But when the nights grew long and cold, and fevers swept through homes like shadows, you did whatever you could, even if that meant placing salt on the windowsill or wearing your clothes inside out for luck. In every village, there was always someone who knew things. She might be feared or sought out in desperation, and when the healer's herbs didn't work, people turned to charms, to chants, to the strange rituals of those who walked the edges of belief. Mistletoe, believed to hold life even in winter, wasn't just for celebration. It was hung for protection. The green against the grey, a living thing in a world asleep. The peasants watched the natural world closely. If owls hooted thrice, bad luck was near. If the dog barked at nothing, a spirit had passed. If the fire wouldn't light, someone in the home was cursed. Superstition was logic in a world that had no answers. Small things held big meanings, a charm sewn into your clothing, a nail hammered into a tree at midnight, a handful of earth from a grave placed beneath your bed. These weren't just rituals, they were lifelines, because when nothing else worked, belief was the final medicine. Cats were both feared and revered. They hunted mice, but were also thought to see what others could not. To some, they were witches' familiars. To others, quiet protectors in the night. A cat that stayed near the fire meant peace. A cat that stared at the door for too long might mean something else entirely. They burned juniper. They buried onions. They left food out for restless souls. Because the line between the living and the dead felt thinner when snow blanketed the world. These rituals weren't nonsense. They were comfort, control in the uncontrollable. And of course, the church watched all of this with wary eyes. Too much superstition was called heresy, but the church itself had relics. Saints' bones, holy water, candles blessed on sacred days. The people wove it all together, of faith, fear, folklore, into a tapestry of survival in the darkest hours of winter, when coughs shook walls and dreams turned cold. Peasants turned to every tool they had, herbs for the body, belief for the soul, and sometimes, just sometimes, a simple symbol on the door was enough to hold the darkness back. In the heart of the cold season, when snow painted the fields white and the world slowed beneath its weight, one question mattered most. What shall we eat tonight? To survive a medieval winter was no small feat, and beyond fire, furs, and faith came food, or the lack of it. But even here, in modest huts and frost-bitten farms, peasants found ways to keep their bellies warm. Bread, not the kind we know today. dense, dark, made from rye, oats, or barley. Wheat was rare, expensive, and saved for the rich. But the peasant's loaf was nourishing, a mixture of whatever grains were stored, ground roughly with millstone or mortar. Bread was the centerpiece, the plate, the spoon, the meal, and then there was broth. You see, in cold seasons, a warm belly was half the battle. Peasants learned to boil everything, roots like turnips and parsnips, old onions, bits of dried meat if lucky, salt if precious reserves allowed. They called it pottage, a simple stew, always changing, always reused. It simmered for hours, sometimes days, becoming thicker, richer, as more was added. Winter greens, like kale and cabbage, could last in storage or survive under light frost. These too found their way into the pot, and on special days, if the gods smiled, a bone, not a feast, but flavour, even a bone with no meat, could be boiled again and again, giving its essence to the broth. In famine, a single carrot was worth its weight in silver. There were no second helpings, no waste. The bowl might be passed from child to elder, the bread soaked soft, the broth sipped slowly as the cold pressed at the door. And yet there was warmth, because food wasn't just fuel. It was a moment to sit, to gather, to share silence. Or a song flavour came from the forest and garden. Herbs dried in autumn hung like trophies, meagre but powerful. A pinch of sage, a crumble of thyme, not just for taste, but for medicine, for memory, because a meal seasoned with rosemary carried a hint of summer days long since gone. Sometimes it wasn't a stew, but something simple, an oat cake roasted on stone, rough, dry, crumbly, but warm, and enough, because survival meant creativity, and peasants were masterful at stretching little into something meaningful. Legumes played their quiet part. Dried peas and beans, stored from the harvest or bartered with neighbours, were high in sustenance. They boiled long, smelled strong, but filled you for hours, and in a world without breakfast, cereal or coffee, that was more than enough. Even the forest offered gifts: nuts, berries dried from autumn, mushrooms if one knew what was safe. A squirrel's stash, borrowed, not stolen. And when times were good, or holy days came near, there might be a pig slaughtered, a chicken stewed. Or a pie made of roots and herbs wrapped in thick pastry. Those were rare days, marked by song, remembered long, but most nights it was bread and broth and patience. Food was memory, it was community, it was comfort when the outside world gave none. And as snow pressed against the walls, and the wind howled through the thatch above, a bowl of stew, a shared piece of bread, was enough to hold the darkness at bay. In the medieval world, life and death were not distant cousins. They were neighbours, always close, always watching. From the moment of birth, a child's cry pierced a world steeped in hardship, but never without care. For the peasants, birth was a sacred private moment. Not in hospitals, not beneath sterile lights, but at home, among women, by firelight, with the scent of herbs and warm cloth. The midwife was not just a helper, she was healer, keeper of generations, a living book of knowledge passed down through whispered instruction. She had no written charts, only hands that knew when to soothe, and eyes that could read danger before it arrived. Sometimes she succeeded, and new life began with a breath, a bath in warm water, and a prayer. Other times, the silence after labour was the first shadow cast over a new family. Infant mortality was high. Half of all children might not live past the age of 5, and yet every birth was a victory, every new face a flicker of hope. They were named not in celebration, but in protection, often after saints or ancestors, hoping their spirit might shield the child from the winds of fate. Childhood, too, was brief. A toddler became a helper. A 6-year-old might carry water, gather kindling, chase away crows. By 7 or 8, many boys would begin learning trades, perhaps under a blacksmith or helping their father in the field. Girls were little women before they ever became teens, helping with hearth, siblings, food. There was laughter, games made of sticks and stones, stories whispered by firelight, songs sung with rhythm and rhyme. But the innocence of youth was often wrapped in responsibility. Peasants learned early. Life was short. Every year mattered. As childhood slipped into adulthood, the path became clear. Work, wed, worship, and wait. Marriage, for most, was not for romance, but survival. A joining of land, labour, and lineage. Ceremonies were small. A church if one could afford it. A priest if one was nearby. Sometimes only witnesses and an oath under open sky. Still, there was love. Peasants laughed together, sang together, argued, grieved, forgave. Even without luxury, they found meaning in moments. A shared meal, a warm bed, a child's first word, and then death. It could come quickly. Fever, childbirth, accident, infection. It could wait until old age, though that age might be 50. Death was no stranger. It came often, but rarely without ritual. The church guided the soul's journey. Candles were lit, prayers whispered, bodies laid to rest in simple graves, often wrapped only in linen, but the living grieved as we do now. They mourned, sang laments, placed flowers, remembered names. Some believed the dead watched over them. Others saw signs in birds, dreams, weather. There was comfort in tradition, a belief that death was not an end, but a passage from the cradle to the grave. Medieval peasants walked a road worn by many before them. Each birth was a defiance of winter, each death a whisper into eternity. And in between, they lived not in chapters, but in circles, of labour, love, loss, and legacy. Though survival was always at the forefront of a medieval peasant's life, community brought a rhythm that gave life depth and meaning. Work was essential, yes, but it was the moments in between, the gatherings, the celebrations, the ceremonies that lifted spirits and forged bonds. At the centre of it all was the village square, or perhaps a worn patch of earth near the church where neighbours came together. It wasn't just a place to barter or trade, it was the beating heart of the village. A space where news travelled faster than the wind, and stories spun like golden thread. Market day came, perhaps, once a week, and it was as social as it was practical. Housewives exchanged gossip over cabbages. Old men debated the weather as if it were royal politics. The arrival of a travelling merchant or entertainer was cause for quiet excitement. Children tugged at sleeves to get closer to a juggler or hear the first notes of a minstrel's lute. These rare bursts of colour, bright ribbons, exotic spices, carved toys, offered a glimpse into a world beyond the fields, a flicker of wonder. Entertainment in the medieval countryside was infrequent, but when it came, it was savoured like honey on bread. A puppet show in a barn, a jester balancing on a barrel, a troupe of musicians arriving with bells and whistles tied to their knees. Children gasped, women laughed, and for a moment the burdens of life melted into applause and joy. Evenings were often spent in shared stories by the hearth. Legends of brave peasants, trickster animals, or eerie forest spirits passed down through generations. These weren't merely amusements, they were lessons, comforts, and cultural glue. Weddings were among the most joyful and meaningful events in village life. When two young people were betrothed, the entire village played a role. There might not be rings or priests in grand robes, but there were vows, sometimes spoken before neighbors, other times before the village church. A simple cord tied around joined hands, or a shared sip from a cup of mead was enough to bind them. The feast that followed, however humble, was always a celebration. Bread was broken, ale was poured, and laughter flowed freely. The fiddler's strings filled the air, and bare feet stamped into the dirt, dancing until the stars blinked awake. These dances were not just tradition, they were expression. Movements often mirrored everyday life. Planting, harvesting, chasing, circling. Each step told a story. And in those moments of synchronized joy, peasants reminded one another that even a life of hardship had moments of sweetness worth savoring. Of course, life in the village included sorrow too. When someone died, the village gathered not just to mourn, but to remember. Wakes were somber yet sacred occasions. Candles flickered beside a simple wooden casket. Bread and ale were passed hand to hand. Tales of the departed were whispered around the hearth. Some wakes ended with singing, others with silence. It was understood that loss was not an individual burden, but a communal one, carried together, lessened by the shared weight. Faith wove through all of it, from the joy of weddings to the grief of farewells. Every occasion had its blessing, its prayer, its moment of reflection. A child's first steps, a young man's departure to work far afield, the changing of seasons. All were marked with some communal observance. These weren't grand rituals, but small sacred acknowledgments of life's turning wheel. Despite poverty, despite cold winters and lean harvests, what the peasantry possessed in abundance was connection. Not one man or woman stood alone. A neighbor's joy was your own. A neighbor's loss echoed through your walls. Evenings ended with quiet fires, shared stories, and the comfort of knowing tomorrow the same faces would be there, weathered by life, but still smiling. Their joys were modest, their losses deep, but in between, peasants wove a kind of beauty that modern life rarely pauses to see. They laughed and danced, wept and worshipped, all beneath the same sky we sleep under now. And in their simple togetherness, they carved a kind of immortality, not in stone, but in memory. While every day in a medieval peasant's life was tethered to toil, not all days were alike. The passage of time was not tracked by clocks, but by feasts, saints' days, planting seasons, and harvest festivals. These markers were as sacred as they were social, rituals of rest, belief, and joy carved into the otherwise endless churn of labor. They were pauses in the rhythm, deep breaths in a life lived close to the earth. Superstition and faith lived side by side, woven tightly into the fabric of peasant thought. It was believed that bread left unblessed might mold faster, that spilling salt could draw the devil's eye, that the sound of an owl at night foretold a death nearby. But belief wasn't born from fear alone. It was how people made sense of a world they could not control, a world of droughts and storms, of unseen illnesses and uncertain harvests. Faith brought order. Superstition gave warning. The church calendar shaped much of the year. Candlemas in February brought a blessing of fire and warmth. Easter promised rebirth after a long winter's sleep. May Day arrived with flower crowns and dancing ribbons. And harvest festivals in late summer were jubilant and sacred, giving thanks for the grain, the fruit, the work of hands and heavens alike. These days were not idle, they were sacred interruptions. Time itself felt different under a festival sky. Games and sports, simple, rough, joyful, were the pulse of celebration. Wrestling matches took place in muddy fields. Stickball and stoolball were played by men and women alike, using whatever tools they had. On feast days, entire villages might turn out for a foot race or a contest of strength. There were no prizes but pride, no trophies but laughter. These moments of play reminded even the most burdened farmer that joy, like toil, was part of life's cycle. Some games were storytelling in disguise. Shadow plays by the fire, riddles exchanged over meals, songs with hidden meanings passed from mouth to ear, year to year. These kept minds nimble and spirits light. Evenings after feast days glowed with firelight and laughter, as tales grew taller and more magical with each retelling. Fairies in the forest, giants in the hills, a night cursed to wander forever. Stories like these weren't just fantasy, they were anchors in mystery, threads of shared imagination. Many peasants believed the year turned in great wheels. 4 seasonal festivals that predated Christianity still echoed in rural traditions. Samhain in late October, the forerunner of today's Halloween, marked the thinning of the veil between worlds. Bonfires were lit to ward off spirits. The winter solstice welcomed the return of the sun, while spring equinox promised balance and fertility. These pagan echoes lived quietly beneath the Christian rites, honored in secret by some, remembered in rituals by many. Rainbows were omens, dreams could carry messages. The first butterfly of spring was a sign of good fortune, or bad, depending on its color. To the modern mind, these may seem quaint, but in an age where life was fragile and unknowable, these signs brought meaning and comfort. They offered a sense that life was more than chance, that someone or something was listening, watching, guiding from just beyond the veil. Saints' days were also deeply revered. Villages had their own patron saints, whose statues might be paraded through muddy roads during festivals. Prayers were said for good weather, for fertility, for healing. Sometimes relics, bone fragments, cloth, or a vial of oil were believed to hold protective power. Pilgrims journeyed on foot for weeks to see them. To peasants, these objects were tangible links to the divine, proof that heaven wasn't far away after all. Even dreams were taken seriously. Dreaming of water could mean death or birth. Dreaming of fire might mean passion or loss or revelation. Dreams were shared the next morning like news. They were analyzed around cook fires, whispered to elders, prayed over by worried mothers. The night wasn't only for rest. It was a place where souls wandered and futures whispered in every superstition, every celebration, every strange little game. There lived the essence of medieval peasant life, a belief that life was more than work and suffering, that mystery had meaning, that laughter, even when brief, was worth chasing, that unseen forces, spirits, saints, or stars might just be listening, and perhaps, if we quiet our own lives enough, we might hear them too. Illness was a quiet shadow that never strayed far from the lives of medieval peasants. It arrived like a whisper in the night, a fever, a rash, a shiver, and could unravel a life in days. There were no hospitals in the countryside, no doctors in polished coats. Health was a fragile gift, tended not with science, but with hope, ritual, and whatever nature had to offer. Healing was the work of women. Mothers, grandmothers, midwives, keepers of remedies passed through generations. They knew which root could calm a bellyache, which leaf eased fever, which flower was best for sleep. Their knowledge was often whispered, kept quiet for fear of being misunderstood. The line between healer and witch was a thin one, especially in troubled times. Many believed illness was not just a physical ailment, but a spiritual disturbance. Perhaps it was the result of a sin or a punishment for pride. Others thought sickness could drift in on the wind or slip through the crack of a door if it wasn't properly blessed. Crosses were carved into beams. Holy water was sprinkled near beds. Candles were lit not just for light, but to keep away the darkness that couldn't be seen. The church was both comfort and confusion. Priests offered blessings, and villagers lined up for the sacrament in times of plague or famine. But beyond the Latin and the incense, there was little practical help. Prayers didn't always bring healing, and when disease struck many at once, faith was tested like never before. Still, most clung to it. When medicine failed, the soul was their last hope. Simple illnesses, things that today would be cured in a day, could turn deadly. An infected wound, a tooth abscess, a cough that deepened with the frost. These were not inconveniences, but mortal dangers. There was no penicillin, no painkillers, no antiseptic. Recovery depended on the strength of the body, the will of the spirit, and the care of family. When plagues came, they did not knock quietly. They rushed in like wildfires. Black death, sweating sickness, leprosy. Entire villages were silenced in a matter of weeks. Fields were left unharvested. Doors were marked with ash or red crosses. Survivors didn't always speak of what they'd seen. Some believed to remember was to invite the plague back in. Despite this, peasants did not surrender to despair. Death was seen not as an end, but as a crossing, a soul freed from the body. Graves were dug by hand, bodies wrapped with care, prayers murmured by candlelight. The rituals were simple, but heavy with meaning. Life and death were always close companions, and so too were reverence and resilience. Midwives were guardians not just of birth, but of death. They comforted women in childbirth, a moment as dangerous as it was miraculous. They washed bodies of the stillborn and the lost. They were the quiet hands that steadied the beginning and the end. Their work was neither glamorous nor praised, but it was sacred. Disease, loss, pain, these things did not harden the hearts of peasants. If anything, they drew people closer. Villages mourned together. Meals were shared with the sick. Children were raised by aunts and cousins if parents passed. Community was not just a comfort, it was a shield. No one survived alone. They sang songs of remembrance, left food for spirits, lit candles on anniversaries. Every act of care was a defiance of death's cold grip. And through all of this, life did not stop. Fields were tilled, seeds were sown, babies were born. Laughter returned quietly at first, then stronger.
Life, ever persistent, always found a way to bloom again. To be a peasant in the medieval world was to live with illness not as a stranger, but as a neighbor. Yet with every sickness endured, every child held, every grave honored, they carved resilience into the very bones of their community. In the face of death, they chose care. In the presence of loss, they chose memory. And in the quiet that followed, they chose to begin again. Every village had someone they turned to when illness struck. A healer, a wise woman, or sometimes a quiet man who lived at the forest's edge. These were not doctors in the modern sense. They had no formal training, no grand titles, no scrolls of medical knowledge. What they had was memory, instinct, and a deep, reverent bond with the natural world. The healer's home was unlike any other in the village. It smelled of smoke and lavender, mint and wormwood. Bundles of herbs hung from beams, their leaves whispering in the draught. Clay jars lined shelves, marked not with words, but symbols or colors. Inside were dried roots, powdered bark, beeswax, tallow, and infusions steeped for days in sun-warmed oil. These remedies were drawn from centuries of trial and error, shaped by observation and survival. Feverfew for headaches, yarrow for wounds, nettle for strength, willow bark for pain. The forest was a living apothecary, if one knew where to look and when to gather. Some herbs were only picked under moonlight, others only at dawn. There was magic in the timing, or so the healer believed. But medicine wasn't only made of plants. It was also prayer. It was touch. It was the whisper of comfort offered at a bedside, or the chant sung low to soothe a frightened child. Healing meant more than curing. It meant calming, protecting, restoring balance between body, spirit, and the mysterious world beyond. Healers often walked a fine line in their communities, admired but feared, sought out in desperation, yet spoken of in hushed tones. Their knowledge set them apart. In times of panic, that difference could feel dangerous to some. Accusations of witchcraft were never far. A failed healing, a death misunderstood, these things could turn trust into suspicion. Still, they kept working. For every whispered doubt, there were 10 quiet thanks. A wound closed cleanly, a cough that passed, a child saved from fever. The healer's life was not one of wealth or comfort, but of purpose. Even when the village's gratitude faded, the herbs still grew. The sun still rose. The work continued. Healing wasn't just about treating what was seen. It was about knowing what couldn't be. The healer watched people closely. A mother who stopped singing, a man who drank too early in the day, a child whose laughter faded after a hard winter. There was no name for these ailments, but they were no less real. A poultice could not mend a broken heart, but a carefully chosen story or gesture might help it begin to heal. In some ways, the healer was also the village's memory keeper. She remembered births and deaths. She held stories of the old plagues, the long winters, the years when bread was scarce. Her words linked generations. When the elders passed on, she became their voice. When new mothers gave birth, they looked to her for guidance that had once come from their own grandmothers. Time moved slowly in her world. A remedy might take days to steep. Healing was never rushed. Pain was listened to, not ignored. Illness was met with patience. There was dignity in the stillness, in the waiting. In a world that spun with hardship and toil, the healer's presence offered something rare: pause. And when the healer herself grew old, the knowledge did not end with her. She passed it on, quietly, to an apprentice, a niece, a neighbor's daughter, someone with attentive eyes and gentle hands. The legacy continued not through books, but through demonstration, repetition, and trust. It was a lineage shaped in silence. So when you imagine medieval life, do not forget the healer in her garden, the woman who whispered to plants, the man who understood roots and bones, the hands that soothed more wounds than could be counted. Their wisdom was never written down, but it lived in the health of every peasant who survived. In a time without modern medicine, their quiet care was the difference between pain and peace. It came like a whisper at first. A cough heard from the neighbor's cottage, A shutter closed too early in the day. The baker's son, who didn't show up to fetch water from the well. In the beginning, no one said it aloud. They hoped it was just a passing illness, like the fevers that came and went with the changing seasons. But beneath the silence, there was a growing weight, a stillness too deep, even for winter. Then came the signs. A child with swollen glands. A man with dark bruises on his legs that had no cause. People fell ill quickly, some within hours. Others lingered in fevered sleep, sweating and crying out for water or mercy. Word spread in whispers. The pestilence, they called it. The Black Death. There was no understanding of germs or transmission, only fear. The village didn't know how it began, maybe from a rat's bite or a merchant's cart that passed through from another town. Perhaps it was punishment from God or the devil's doing. Whatever the cause, they knew one thing. It was here. People turned to prayers. Churches filled with candlelight and trembling voices. Others fled to the woods, hoping distance would keep them safe. But the plague was already inside the village. It had walked through the front gate unseen. Not even the healer could stop it. She did what she could, offering potions, burning herbs, chanting softly, but she too grew weary. The herbs did little. The dying continued. Fear changed the shape of the village. Doors were nailed shut, markets closed. Even the familiar comfort of gathering by the communal fire became a memory. Mothers clung to children. Some villagers turned to superstition. Ashes drawn in symbols above beds. Cold river baths to cleanse the sin. The smell of vinegar and onions filled rooms, believed to ward off the sickness. Some remained calm, trusting in fate or faith. Others fell into panic. A neighbor who once shared their bread would now bolt the door. Those who touched the sick were feared, even if they did so in kindness. Compassion became a quiet rebellion. And yet, even in this dark time, moments of humanity endured. A grandmother who refused to leave her grandson's bedside. A brother who sang softly to his sister as she slipped into sleep for the last time. These small acts of love were lanterns in the shadows. The plague did not stay forever. Eventually, the sickness burned through what it could. Some lived, some did not. No one understood why. Strong men perished while the frail survived. Children recovered while elders fell. The healer, who had seen death many times before, sat by the fire one evening and whispered, "It takes who it wants, no more, no less." When the last funeral was held and the pyres burned low, the village remained, quieter, sadder, changed. The roads had grown over with moss, tools rusted. But life, stubborn and quiet, stirred again. A baby cried. A rooster crowed. Bread was baked. These small sounds felt like songs. Those who remained were never the same. They had learned to live with the memory of absence. Fields were planted again. Homes reopened. But the fear never truly left. Every cough, every shadow at the edge of the forest reminded them. The Black Death was not a story from another place. It had lived among them. Still, they endured. That was the lesson the plague left behind. Survival did not mean ignoring sorrow. It meant planting seeds even when your hands shook. It meant rebuilding with fewer hands but the same heart. The peasants, long forgotten by history's grander pages, had met a storm and stood through it. Quietly, humbly, as they always had. And as the stars returned to the sky, they whispered no triumph, no celebration. Only silence. Only the breath of a people who still knew how to sleep, to wake, and to keep going. When the darkest nights were behind them, and the earth began to soften once more, The village stirred with a different kind of energy, one not shaped by fear or survival, but by gratitude. It began subtly, a fresh loaf of bread shared with a neighbor, a jug of cider passed around a quiet fire. Laughter, tentative at first, rose again, and soon plans were made. The village would feast. The feast was more than a meal. It was a declaration. We are still here. Peasants who had toiled through frost and plague knew better than anyone the value of togetherness. And so, once the barley was threshed, the onions pulled, and the pigs fattened, the day was chosen. It did not matter if there was much. What mattered was sharing it. Every family brought something to the table: salted fish from the pond, roasted roots, thick stews made from stored grains, sweet apple pastes, and hard cheeses. Even the poorest offered what they could: a small loaf, a bundle of herbs, or simply a song. Long wooden tables were set under the sky. No tapestries or silver goblets here, only clay mugs and wooden spoons, rough-hewn but honest. Torches were lit as the sun dipped low. Children darted beneath the tables, dogs barked cheerfully, and elders settled near the fire. There were no formal speeches, no nobility in fine robes to lead the night. Instead, a woman with strong hands and a soot-darkened face stood and simply said, "To those who came before, and to those who are still here." Every mug was raised. The feast began. The food, while simple, carried stories. That barley? It had been rescued from mold by a desperate drying near the hearth. Those apples? Picked during the harvest festival years ago, and stored in straw-lined barrels? Every bite a memory, every swallow a quiet thanks to the land and those who worked it. And then came the music. Not the refined sounds of court minstrels, but the soul-deep rhythm of drums made from old hide, flutes carved from bone, and voices that had sung through sorrow. Songs were shared that night, some ancient, passed from mother to child, others invented on the spot. Old stories resurfaced. Tales of the harvest moon, of foxes who stole chickens and were outwitted by clever boys, of a ghostly white dog who only appeared on the eve of a good omen. Every tale was met with smiles and gasps. For peasants, storytelling was more than entertainment. It was a way of keeping the dead close and the living connected. The feast lasted long into the night. Stars shimmered overhead, watching the flickering fire and moving shadows below. For one night, time slowed. The burdens of land, law, tax, and toil faded. No kings, no lords, just people, warmed by fire and filled with food, letting their laughter return. There was dancing, too. Not grand or choreographed, but spontaneous and joyful. Bare feet on packed earth, arms linked, elders swayed with children, and mothers danced alone, arms raised to the sky. The music rose and fell like breath. As midnight approached, some began to drift away, blankets wrapped around shoulders, children carried gently in arms. Others stayed by the fire, quiet now, staring into the flames. The feast had done what it needed to. It reminded them they were human, that even in a world ruled by hardship, joy was still possible. Not in palaces, but in moments, in shared food, in simple songs. The village, like so many across medieval Europe, would face more winters, more taxes, more loss. But they would always return to this, the feast. It was not about bounty. It was about resilience, about finding light, however dim, and gathering around it. In the end, the feast was not the end, but the promise. That even in the coldest chapters, warmth could be made, shared, and remembered. As twilight painted the village in shades of fading gold, a stranger arrived. Not a merchant or a knight, but something far rarer, a storyteller. Wrapped in layers of cloth faded by years and wind, she moved with the rhythm of someone who had walked through dozens of settlements and watched storytellers were once common, traveling from hamlet to town, exchanging tales for food and fire. But now, fewer dared the roads, especially in winter. Bandits lingered in the woods, and superstition clung to every crossroad. Still, this one came. Not for silver or shelter, but to keep alive what would otherwise be forgotten. She sat cross-legged beside the central fire. Her eyes, bright and knowing, caught the flickering flame like mirrors to another world. And then, without prompt, she began. The first story was not of kings or saints, but of a blacksmith's daughter who learned to speak to animals after rescuing a wounded hawk. Her tale was one of silent woods, forgotten runes, and a heart brave enough to defy winter itself. The children leaned forward. Even the adults, jaded by toil and grief, found themselves stilled. The firelight danced across faces worn by weather, yet for that brief moment, they were young again, seeing the world through stories. Her second tale spoke of a village lost to time, swallowed by snow, where the only survivor was an old woman who grew food using only her breath and memory. She whispered to seeds, warmed them with songs, and when spring returned, she was gone. But the fields grew wild and full long after. Between stories, she sipped from a wooden cup. No one dared interrupt. Even the dogs had gone quiet. A baby, once restless, now slept peacefully in its mother's arms. It was as though the night itself listened. She told of things forgotten, the star that only rose on nights of true forgiveness, the well where dreams once gathered in the form of birds, the frost that painted messages for those who watched with patience. Her voice never rose, never pushed, only flowed, soft and sure, like water around stones. These weren't just stories. They were maps of hope, coded in wonder, drawn from centuries of peasant memory, lessons wrapped in wonder. No one took notes. There was no need. The words would nest inside them, to be whispered again by someone else. One day, beside another fire, she stayed only one night. Come morning, the traveler was gone. No goodbye, no trace. Just an empty bowl, a blanket folded neatly, and a trail of footprints that vanished past the tree line. And yet, her presence lingered. That week, laughter came easier. Frowns softened. A child began mimicking the hawk girl's song. A boy carved a wooden flute like the one from her second story. The world felt, somehow, less heavy. In a time where written words were rare and parchment was expensive, the storyteller's voice became scripture. Not from a pulpit, but from the earth, spoken in kitchens, murmured in fields, remembered in winter silence. A sacred reminder that even those without wealth or title had myths worth telling. Perhaps she was never truly real. Perhaps she was a dream sent by the forest. Or maybe, as some believed, she had once been a noblewoman who gave up her name to gather stories instead of jewels. No one knew. And in that lay her power. The traveler may have left, but the flame she lit would burn through generations. A fire of story, a fire of memory. In the coldest weeks of winter, when frost thickened the windows and breath turned to fog indoors, Warmth became a communal act. It was not found in solitude, nor in grand feasts or silken garments, but in the closeness of bodies and hearts. To survive meant to share, and among peasants, nothing symbolized that better than the shared blanket. These weren't fine tapestries or fur-lined throws. They were heavy, sometimes scratchy, often patched. Made from wool spun by hand, dyed with roots or left plain and gray, they carried the smell of smoke, fields, and time. And yet, they were sacred, passed down from parent to child, mended by firelight, cherished for their warmth and their history. Under these blankets, families didn't just sleep, they connected. Infants slept between parents, cradled by mother and father's warmth. Grandparents nestled alongside grandchildren, telling soft tales as fingers traced old stitchings. In winter, space was scarce, but hearts were wide. Even neighbors, in times of hardship, might share a bed or corner of the fire when illness or storm swept in. It was not shameful to sleep close. It was necessary. Entire generations grew up in the same room, separated by nothing more than the order in which they laid down. Brothers next to sisters, cousins, and parents aligned like puzzle pieces. The medieval peasant bed was rarely one of romance. It was of survival. And in that closeness, comfort bloomed. During harsh winters, some would sleep in shifts, rotating their spots closest to the fire. Others placed warm stones at their feet beneath the covers, wrapped in cloth and heated by the coals. If wood ran short, they curled tighter. The goal was not luxury, it was endurance. And love, even unspoken, wove itself into every thread. Mothers would often check the temperature of their children's hands and noses. Fathers, worn from the field, might fall asleep mid-story, head resting on a bundle of hay. Grandmothers, the true memory keepers, would hum softly, half lullaby, half prayer, while watching over the younger ones. Even animals sometimes joined the warmth. Cats curled beside sleeping children, dogs at their feet, sometimes even chickens in a basket nearby. Brought inside not for affection, but because their lives were just as fragile to the cold. And so the shared blanket was more than fabric. It was a symbol of peasant resilience, of what it meant to survive together. In the nobility's stone halls, warmth came from tapestries, goblets of spiced wine, and layered cloaks. In the peasant's home, it came from proximity and patience, and the unspoken agreement that no one should sleep cold if there was room to share. Winter often brought silence, but beneath the covers there were shared whispers. Children asked questions they were too afraid to voice during the day. Parents reassured without words. Old stories were retold, not for entertainment, but for reassurance. We've made it through worse. We'll survive this too. These blankets absorbed secrets, dreams, and warmth, and when they wore thin, they were not discarded. They were reinforced, layered with old tunics, lined with straw, or cut and stitched into cloaks for the youngest. Nothing was wasted, nothing forgotten. Even now, across centuries, the symbol lingers. In every warm embrace on a cold night, in every shared coat between friends in stormy weather, in every hand extended toward those with less, there is the memory of those early winters, of peasants drawing closer, not just for heat, but for hope. Even the coldest nights could not extinguish the quiet warmth that lives between people, woven not from thread, but from trust. There were winters that came not just with cold, but with silence. a silence that buried the harvest, froze the streams, and pressed down on village life like a heavy stone. To the medieval peasant, winter was not simply a season, it was a reckoning. And some winters were crueler than others. In the harshest years, cold arrived early, before the grains had been fully stored or the root vegetables pulled from the earth. Rivers froze thick, trapping fish beneath glass. Wells crusted over. Fires burned constantly, yet rarely chased away the chill. Bread grew stale too quickly, and soup thinned as food was rationed day by day. The winters of 1315 to 1317 brought what chroniclers called the Great Famine. Rains had ruined the crops that summer, and when the cold set in early, it turned scarcity into crisis. Across much of Europe, the granaries emptied. Peasants boiled old leather to soften it for chewing. Bark and weeds were ground into flour. In the darkest hours, desperate rumors whispered of cannibalism, though no one dared speak such things aloud. But not every winter was filled with dread. Some brought strange beauty. When the River Thames froze solid, it became more than just a casualty of the cold. It became a stage. In the 17th century, during what historians now call the Little Ice Age, Londoners held what would be known as the Frost Fairs. On thick ice that held firm for weeks, merchants set up shop. Blacksmiths hammered horseshoes while children threw snowballs between booths. Bonfires blazed atop the river itself, and even printing presses were hauled onto the frozen water to sell commemorative pamphlets, souvenirs printed on the Thames. It was a spectacle, a reprieve, a laugh in the face of the season's cruelty. Yet such joys were rare. For every frost fair, there were dozens of villages where snow crept in under thatch, and hunger sat beside families like an uninvited guest. The cold shaped more than just the days. It carved fear into the collective memory of those who lived through it. Some villages turned to prayer, ringing bells to keep the storms away. Others blamed sin, witches, or the wrath of divine forces. Superstition rose with every drop in temperature. Fires were stoked higher not just for warmth, but for protection from what people didn't understand. Still, resilience bloomed even in this bleakness. In Finland and Russia, peasants packed snow around their cottages for insulation. In the Alps, villagers tunneled through drifts taller than men to reach their neighbors. In Scotland, they told tales of winter spirits to entertain children while keeping them safe indoors. And through all this, the sun always returned. Slowly, tentatively, light would begin to stretch across the horizon again. Snowdrops pushed through melting frost. Ice cracked and sang as rivers broke free, and the peasant, thin but alive, stepped out into a thawed world once more. They survived not because the winter was kind, but because they were determined to endure. Through famine and frost, they persisted. Huddled beneath wool, warmed by story, lifted by hope. Some winters, the earth itself seemed frozen in place. But even then, the hearts of the humble beat onward, slow, steady, and ever hopeful. There are times in history when nature itself turns against routine, when patterns shatter, when seasons blur. The Little Ice Age, lasting from the 14th to the 19th century, was not one long winter, but rather an age of unpredictable chills, sudden storms, and years where summer seemed to vanish entirely. Peasants, always attuned to the land, were the first to notice. Crops bloomed later, or not at all. Rain fell when it should not. Frost came early and overstayed its welcome. Vineyards in England withered. Wheat refused to ripen, and famine crept across the continent, not always in waves, but in quiet, creeping hunger. Villages that had once thrived with the rhythm of spring and harvest now braced for erratic seasons. One year would be bountiful, the next barren. Calendars failed them. The sun no longer kept its promises. In Norway, glaciers advanced downhill, swallowing entire farms beneath creeping walls of ice. In Switzerland, villagers held religious processions to beg the mountains to stop. In the Netherlands, canals froze solid so often that ice skating became not only a joy, but a reliable way to travel between towns. But laughter was scarce in the highlands. In mountainous areas, avalanches became more frequent. Whole communities vanished beneath snow. Livestock perished. Sheep were found frozen in place, their fleece stiff and crusted with frost. The peasants' world narrowed during these years. Winters grew longer. Livestock had to be kept indoors. People burned peat, dung, and whatever scrap wood they could find to stay alive. But for many, no fuel was enough to keep the frost away. In poorly sealed cottages, frost formed on the inside of walls, the cold crept into culture as well. Artists painted snow-covered villages and grim skies. Poets described the sting of frost as if it were a living thing. Even in warmer months, people spoke of the next winter with a kind of inherited dread, like a returning illness. Yet, there was ingenuity amid the hardship. In Scandinavia, people began building their homes half buried in the earth to retain heat. In Russia, windows were covered with greased parchment or animal skins to trap warmth. In Scotland and Ireland, thick woolen cloaks became both armor and comfort. The climate affected far more than temperature. When food was short, immunity fell. Plague and disease followed. Malnutrition was the invisible enemy, weakening bones, dulling minds, stealing generations. And still, the cold came. It was impartial. It didn't care who you were or what you believed. There are records, fragments really, of people planting in snow, of festivals canceled for fear of frostbite, of weddings held indoors by firelight, guests bundled in furs, dancing softly, huddled tightly, and always. They waited. Waited for the spring that didn't come. Waited for the sun to return in full. Waited for warmth, not just in the air, but in their bones. Some waited years, but the people of this strange climate age, this forgotten era of frost, did what peasants had always done. They endured. They rewrote their rhythms. They passed stories beside the hearth and handed down lessons in resilience through lullabies. The Little Ice Age may not have frozen the world entirely, but it changed the way humanity faced it. For centuries, even in summer, they kept their cloaks close, just in case winter had not truly ended. Adaptation wasn't just a matter of endurance. It was survival forged from desperation. In the centuries that marked the coldest stretch of the Little Ice Age, peasants had no choice but to evolve. To survive in a world that no longer followed familiar rules, they turned to both innovation and tradition. In the harshest regions, stone houses were sunk lower into the earth. Cellars became refugees. In Ireland and northern France, people dug deeper hearths to pull heat downward and keep it inside. Wooden shutters were padded with hay and sealed with mud or wool scraps. Windows became rarer. They were considered weaknesses, holes through which heat escaped. Instead, the homes glowed dimly with tallow candles or firelight alone. These homes, while dark, trapped warmth like a cave. Food storage also had to evolve. Salted meats, dried beans, and fermented vegetables filled wooden barrels stacked deep in root cellars. Some villages even shared underground stores, protected by thick doors and guarded by communal rules. Because in winter, theft could mean death. Clothing thickened into layers not just of fabric, but of culture. Wool cloaks became lined with fur from rabbits, foxes, or sheep. In Russia, felted boots and fur hats were passed from parent to child. In Scandinavia, entire suits were made of layered wool soaked in animal fat to repel water and block the chill. In more desperate regions, people adapted their diets to what the cold would still allow. Turnips and rye replaced wheat. Mushrooms, collected from under snow-damp logs, were dried and saved. Lichens and tree bark were boiled into broths when nothing else remained. Communal baking houses became vital. Villages often had 1 or 2 central ovens, burning almost constantly. The warmth became more than practical. It became psychological. People would huddle near the brick ovens, sharing stories, warmth, and the illusion of hope. Religious rituals shifted too. Churches, previously drafty stone chambers, began holding smaller services by candlelight in nearby homes. Superstition rose with the cold. Some believed witches had cursed the land. Others claimed saints were angry and required offerings. Across Europe, society subtly reorganized itself around warmth. Markets shrank to a few stalls huddled near fires. Inns became lifelines. Entire economies twisted toward wood and wool. Tradespeople who worked with warmth, blacksmiths, bakers, brewers, became essential to survival, even more than lords or priests. In colder areas like the Alps or northern Scandinavia, skiing re-emerged, not for sport, but survival. Hunters strapped wooden planks to their boots to cross snow-covered terrain faster and bring food home before it spoiled. And even in towns, frost fairs became moments of collective resilience. When the Thames froze solid, Londoners set up stalls, games, and even makeshift printing presses on the ice. For a few days, people laughed in defiance of the cold, making memories where others feared only loss. These adaptations were not grand revolutions. They were humble, day-by-day shifts. A thicker blanket, a new way to seal a door, a shared cup of soup. But over generations, they became lifelines. Peasants didn't outwit the cold. They coexisted with it, shaped by it, and slowly changed their entire way of life to endure it. They became winterfolk. Their lives were shaped by the long months of frost, by the silence that blanketed fields and forests, by the endurance it demanded. Winter was not a season to them. It was a teacher, stern and unyielding. It stripped away excess, cut to the bone of life, and showed what truly mattered. In that stripping away, something essential emerged. Community, memory, and faith that the turning of the world would one day bring warmth again. It was in the stillness of winter nights that they discovered their deepest strength. With little to occupy restless hands, they turned inward. Stories became their warmth, carrying voices across time. A tale told by the fire was as nourishing as bread, a reminder that though the cold pressed hard against the walls, life still pulsed within. Children listened wide-eyed, repeating fragments until they became their own. A story whispered by a mother could soothe fears as effectively as a blanket. In that way, generations remained bound together, not by wealth or power, but by the invisible thread of memory. Faith, too, grew sharper in the cold. In chapels no larger than cottages, villagers knelt on rough planks and whispered prayers into air that smelled of wax and smoke. They prayed for the thaw, for the seed beneath the soil, for the return of the sun. The grandeur of great cathedrals mattered little here. What mattered was belief itself, the quiet conviction that spring would return, that suffering was not endless, that each soul was seen, even in obscurity. This belief became a lamp carried through the dark, guiding them when all else faltered. And so, winter shaped them into people who knew how to endure. They knew that survival was not only about food, but about closeness. A loaf of bread stretched further when shared. A blanket patched and repatched carried the warmth of many hands. A candle lit in prayer burned not just for one, but for all who huddled in its glow. They lived not as isolated beings, but as a village bound together, each person a necessary flame in the larger fire of survival. When the thaw finally came, it was greeted not with triumphant shouts, but with quiet gratitude. The first drip of water from an eave, the first green shoot breaking through frost, the first bird's call returning to the air. These were the true celebrations. Each sign carried promise, a reassurance that the cycle continued, that life persisted. The people leaned into these small miracles, savoring them as blessings earned through patience. Yet winter never left them fully. Even in the warmth of summer, its lessons lingered. They did not forget the hunger, the silence, the long nights pressed close together. That memory shaped the way they lived all year round. Nothing was wasted. Every scrap of food was preserved, every garment mended, every tool repaired until it could serve no longer. They had learned that excess was fragile, fleeting, and that endurance came from care and foresight, not from abundance. To the outsider, their lives might have seemed meager. Their cottages were small, their meals plain, their days filled with labor. Yet within this simplicity was a richness outsiders often overlooked. Their songs, rough and unpolished, carried centuries of tradition. Their prayers, whispered in smoky chapels, held generations of hope. Their stories, retold by firelight, bridged the gap between the living and the dead. In every act, they preserved something larger than themselves. They became winter folk not because they loved the cold, but because they had learned to live with it, to bend without breaking. They had discovered that true resilience lies not in resistance alone, but in adaptation. Winter was harsh, but it revealed the depth of human closeness. In enduring it together, they found a strength that no storm could erase. As one season bled into the next, their legacy continued. Children grew into adults who carried the memory of those winters in their bones. They remembered the hunger, and so they valued the harvest. They remembered the silence, and so they cherished song. They remembered the closeness, and so they built families and villages where no one stood entirely alone. In this way, winter's lessons became life's guiding truths, passed forward, unbroken. And though centuries would one day pass, though their names and homes would vanish into time, the essence of their resilience remained. The winters did not only shape their survival, they shaped their identity. To be born into such a world was to inherit a certain patience, a certain humility before the turning of seasons. They knew that human will could not conquer frost or command the sun. Instead, they learned to live in rhythm with forces larger than themselves, to bend when bending was the only way forward. This rhythm, so ingrained in their daily lives, became the very measure of time. A child born in the heart of winter would grow up hearing stories of how they were swaddled in wool and kept alive by the fire's glow. That child would carry the tale as proof of resilience, as evidence that even in the most difficult hours, life found a way to endure. An elder passing in the depths of frost would be remembered in prayers whispered until the thaw, their memory carried forward by each retelling. In this way, even death was folded into the pattern of survival, softened by ritual, made bearable by faith that the cycle continued. The villagers did not view themselves as masters of their world. They were caretakers, of fields, of animals, of one another. Each task, however small, was tied to the survival of the whole. A woman mending a tunic was not only repairing cloth, she was keeping the cold at bay for someone she loved. A man gathering wood in the gray hours before dawn was not only fueling the hearth, he was protecting the flame that meant life for his family. In the smallest gestures, there was dignity, though no scribe would record their deeds. Feasts became milestones in this pattern, brief respites where joy was celebrated, not because hardship had vanished, but because hardship had been endured. These gatherings were not extravagant, yet they carried profound meaning. A loaf of bread set on the table represented countless hours of sowing, weeding, harvesting, and grinding. A jug of ale was more than a drink. It was a symbol of preservation, of skill passed down through hands that knew how to coax flavor from the earth. The feast was never about plenty. It was about presence, about acknowledging that survival was a collective triumph. Around the fire, songs rose in voices that cracked and wavered, but held a truth deeper than melody. Each note was an offering, a reminder that even in scarcity, beauty had its place. Children learned these songs as naturally as breathing. They carried them forward, reshaping them over years, until the tunes became timeless. Music was not a luxury. It was another form of endurance, a declaration that spirit could not be silenced by frost. It was during these feasts that the old stories resurfaced. Tales of saints who endured suffering, of heroes who wandered the wilderness, of clever peasants who outwitted greedy lords. Each story carried a lesson, but more than that, each one carried hope. A child who heard of a hero surviving the coldest night might lie easier in bed, believing they too could survive until dawn. In this way, imagination became a tool of endurance, just as vital as bread or fire. The villagers knew that joy was fleeting. A good harvest might be followed by a harsh winter. A year of abundance might be undone by blight. Yet they did not reject joy because it was temporary. Instead, they embraced it more fiercely, aware of its rarity. A laugh shared in the depths of winter was not a denial of hardship. It was defiance against it, proof that the cold could not consume everything. To live through such cycles was to gain a perspective modern life often forgets. They did not dream of endless growth, of permanent ease, of seasons without end. They understood that life was a wheel, always turning. Winter would follow autumn, spring would follow winter, and the circle would continue. This acceptance did not make their lives easy, but it gave them a kind of peace. They did not waste themselves fighting what could not be changed. Instead, they focused on what could endure: faith, memory, community. And so, with each passing year, they became more deeply winterfolk. Their very language carried the marks of the season. Phrases for frost, for snow, for the bite of wind. These were part of daily speech. Their prayers asked for warmth, for protection, for steady hands in the face of cold. Their rituals reflected the cycle of light and dark. reminding them that every ending contained the seed of a beginning. Even in moments of sorrow, there was a sense of continuity. A child lost to illness was mourned with bitter tears, yet the community gathered to carry the grief together. In shared sorrow, no one was left entirely alone. The pain did not vanish, but it was eased by the knowledge that it was carried by many shoulders, not just one. In this way, even tragedy revealed the strength of closeness, of a people bound by more than circumstance. Their lives, by the measure of kings and nobles, were small, but to those who lived them, they were vast, filled with meaning in every gesture. To share a crust of bread was an act of generosity as profound as any royal gift. To light a candle against the dark was as sacred as any cathedral service. In their world, survival itself was a holy act, and each day endured was a quiet miracle. Centuries may pass, but these truths remain. We look back and see only fragments, broken cottages, faded records, nameless figures in the margins of history. Yet behind those fragments lies an enduring spirit. The resilience of winter folk whispers to us still, reminding us that survival is built not on wealth or strength alone, but on closeness, on memory, on hope that springs eternal even in the coldest nights. In time, winter gave way to spring, and spring to summer, yet the memory of cold lingered like a shadow in every act. Fields were tilled with urgency, as if to gather strength for the next long night. Grain was stored carefully, salted meats hung in rafters, herbs dried and bundled, all in anticipation of the frost that would surely return. The rhythm of the year was not a fight against inevitability, but a conversation with it, a negotiation where patience mattered more than pride. This relationship with the seasons shaped not only their survival, but their understanding of life itself. They knew that hardship would always return, and so they sought beauty in the fleeting. The color of wildflowers in summer was more vivid because they knew snow would soon bury them. The laughter of children in the fields carried deeper joy because it echoed against the memory of silence. Even love was intensified by the awareness of its fragility. A promise made under starlight or at the edge of a hearth was not lightly given, for they knew how precious such bonds could be when the wind howled and the earth froze. Through this way of life, the winter folk became philosophers of endurance without ever writing a word. They carried their wisdom not in books, but in gestures. In the way a mother adjusted a blanket over a sleeping child. In the way neighbors gathered when illness struck. In the way songs were sung not for perfection, but for the comfort of shared voice. Their philosophy was lived rather than taught, practiced rather than preserved on parchment. The years passed, and still the pattern held. Children grew into parents, elders passed into memory, cottages rose and fell. The wheel of time turned without pause, yet through it all, the essence of their survival remained unchanged. Faith, memory, closeness. These were the true foundations of their world, more enduring than any stone wall or iron gate. As centuries turned, the great kingdoms of their age rose and fell. Rulers changed, wars erupted and faded. Yet the lives of these villagers continued in quiet constancy. Their names were not etched in chronicles, but their breath carried the world forward all the same. Without them, the fields would not have been sown, the bread not baked, the children not raised. Their survival was the invisible foundation upon which greater histories stood. It is easy now to forget them, to think of them only as shadows in manuscripts, as figures bent over plows in faded illustrations. But they were as alive as we are, with hopes and fears, with love and grief, with laughter that rang clear on frosty mornings. They felt hunger in their bellies, warmth in their arms, sorrow in their hearts. Their humanity was no less for being forgotten, and in truth, they are not gone. For what they carried, the lessons of winter, the meaning of closeness, still shapes us. We gather at tables because they once gathered, believing in the sacredness of shared meals. We tell stories at night because they once whispered tales to children against the dark. We light candles in silence because they once prayed with trembling hands, asking for strength to endure. We may not name them, but their legacy lingers in us, unbroken. To say they became winter folk is to say they became timeless. For every winter since has carried something of them within it. When we draw near to a fire, when we lean on one another in hardship, when we find joy even in scarcity, we are echoing their way of life. They may be gone, their cottages crumbled, their songs forgotten, yet the spirit of what they were survives, carried not in monuments, but in the fabric of humanity itself. Imagine them now, in the silence of a long night. A family gathered close on straw beds, the fire casting its faint glow. Outside, snow covers the fields. The forest groans under its weight. The stars watch from afar. Inside, there is warmth. There's a mother humming softly, a father whispering a prayer, a child drifting into dreams with a story on their lips. This is what it meant to live, and this is what endures. Their world was harsh, but within it was tenderness. Their days were labor, but within them was laughter. Their nights were long, but within them was light. And so they teach us still that survival is not enough. To truly live even in the coldest winters is to hold fast to love, to memory, to faith. These are the fires that never go out. As we reflect on their lives, let us carry their whisper forward, a whisper that says, endure, but not alone. Share what you can, however small. Cherish joy, however brief. Believe in the turning of seasons, however slow. For even in the deepest winter, there is a spring waiting to return. They became winter folk, and in becoming so, they gave us a lesson that echoes across centuries. That lesson is not one of despair, but of resilience. Not one of silence, but of shared song. Not one of endings, but of continuance. And as we close this tale, imagine their breath rising in unison in a cold cottage, the faint glow of embers still alive, the promise of dawn waiting just beyond the horizon. Their story is ours now. Their strength is ours to remember. Their endurance is ours to carry. For the fire still burns, the wheel still turns, and we too are winter folk.